Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. Enrica Perucchietti and Roberto Quaglia come together to discuss one of the most talked about audiovisual productions of recent times, Leave the World Behind, the Netflix film directed by Sam Esmail, already known for Mr. Robot. From the very beginning, the tone is unmistakable. In their view, this is the worst film they have ever reviewed over the course of their work on Hollywood propaganda, surpassing even the most disastrous action blockbusters they had previously analyzed. Quaglia is blunt. This film outdoes them all, not least because of its ambition to present itself as a work of substance, a presumption that makes its failure all the more glaring. The conversation begins from a shared premise. The film does not deserve attention from an artistic standpoint, but it certainly does from a political and propagandistic one. It is precisely this contradiction, an aesthetically and narratively failed product that nevertheless conveys messages of considerable interest, that justifies their analysis. Perucchietti and Quaglia set out to dismantle the film piece by piece, aiming not to recreate the viewing experience, which they would discourage for anyone, but rather to offer a reading of the symbolic and ideological layers that underpin it. Leave the World Behind is an apocalyptic thriller based on the best-selling novel of the same name by Ramona Lamb, from which the film diverges in several key respects. The story revolves around a family vacationing on Long Island, composed of two adults played by Julia Roberts and Ethan Hawke, along with their children. The holiday is abruptly interrupted by the arrival of two strangers, portrayed by Mahershala Ali and his co-star, who bring news of a widespread blackout. From that moment on, the two families are forced to share the same physical space as the crisis gradually worsens and the outside world descends into chaos. The film is riddled with unresolved mysteries and hidden meanings, scattered across a runtime that the two commentators describe, without hesitation, as interminable. The ending remains open, giving the illusion that the viewer might somehow determine the fate of the characters. Despite an objectively weak plot, the film boasts a top-tier cast. Alongside Julia Roberts, Ethan Hawke, and Mahershala Ali, Kevin Bacon also appears in a brief cameo, one that Quaglia describes as rather thankless and decidedly unfortunate. Yet the presence of such high-profile names fails to salvage a screenplay that the two commentators do not hesitate to compare, ironically, to something generated by artificial intelligence, so lifeless and implausible do the dialogues appear. It is precisely this disproportion between resources and results that makes the film worthy of analysis. When a production of this kind still manages to reach millions of viewers, one inevitably wonders what forces contributed to its creation and distribution. One element that has particularly captured public attention, and that Perucchietti and Quaglia are keen to highlight, is the presence of Barack and Michelle Obama among the film's executive producers. Quaglia calls this surreal. When, in recent history, has a former president of the United States turned to film production? The detail is far from trivial, as it is documented that Barack Obama actively participated in the creative process, offering input on the subject and directly influencing narrative choices. The artistic outcome of this involvement, Quaglia notes with biting irony, is comparable to that of certain politicians who venture into the realm of cultural storytelling with invariably disappointing results. A comparison that lingers just beneath the surface, evoking past literary and cinematic attempts by political figures who left a stronger mark on public imagination than on the history of art. Perucchietti points out that the Obama-backed production likely helped attract a disproportionate number of viewers and commentators, many of whom focused on relatively superficial aspects. The symbolism of animals, the crazed deer, the flamingos, while the truly significant messages slipped by almost unnoticed. Indeed, the vast majority of reviews and articles circulating online concentrated on these surface-level elements, leaving the deeper layers of the text untouched. This, she suggests, is the typical structure of effective propaganda, constructing a surface layer of interpretation that is engaging enough to absorb the audience's attention, while more consequential content is conveyed quietly, almost stealthily. Amid the film's pervasive dullness and rambling, the two commentators identify a single scene worthy of note: the sequence in which Tesla cars crash on the highway, forming what resembles a graveyard of vehicles. It is the only moment in which something visually striking occurs, the film's sole action scene, so much so that it was prominently featured in the trailer to attract potential viewers. In this sequence, the Teslas, uniformly white, as Quaglia wryly observes, appear to have been hacked or otherwise wrested from their owner's control, driving en masse into catastrophic collisions along a stretch of highway. Whether they fled from a dealership, were remotely controlled, or operated by some other mechanism is never clarified. The film deliberately leaves the nature of the event ambiguous. Quaglia reads an implicit message in this scene: your electric car will betray you. It serves as a veiled warning about the technological vulnerability of connected vehicles, which in the event of a cyber attack could turn into weapons against their own users. But there is more. Perucchietti notes how this scene generates a clear cognitive dissonance, since the very circles that produced the film, symbolically embodied by Obama, are also those most strongly advocating for the transition to electric vehicles and the abandonment of internal combustion engines. On one hand, electric cars are promoted as a solution to climate change. On the other, they are depicted as potential instruments of death in the hands of hackers. Quaglia suggests that this contradiction is not accidental, but follows a precise logic of social control. The deliberate creation of cognitive confusion weakens the public's capacity for judgment and fosters dependence on authority. The phenomenon, he observes, is always aimed at the same goal: producing submission through disorientation. The two commentators also note that the scene may contain a direct jab at Elon Musk, Tesla's owner, who has in the meantime become something of a public enemy number two in the dominant media narrative, second only to Vladimir Putin. These two readings, the symbolic message about technological vulnerability and the political swipe at Musk, do not exclude each other but rather overlap, multiplying the layers of meaning in a film that, paradoxically, contains very few explicit ones. Beyond the soap opera-like structure that occupies most of the film's runtime, there exists a narrative core that Quaglia considers highly significant. Toward the end of the film, the character played by Mahershala Ali finds himself in a car with Ethan Hawke's character and finally reveals the truth about what is happening. According to what he has been told by a former client, a figure in a position of power, there exists a plan, reportedly documented within a U.S. Department of Defense file, aimed at preparing for a civil war. This plan would involve triggering a widespread communications blackout, followed by a phase of massive disinformation, and then a stage of social chaos in which horizontal violence among citizens, becomes the primary tool for destabilizing the country. A particularly significant detail is that of the leaflets dropped by drones across different parts of the country, written in Arabic and seemingly pointing to a terrorist attack. as explained by Kevin Bacon's character. Portrayed as a right-wing conspiracy theorist living in isolation, heavily armed, and well-stocked with supplies, and who paradoxically turns out to be the only character truly prepared to face the apocalyptic crisis. These leaflets are deliberately distributed in varied forms to suggest that the attacks originate from different sources. The aim is to generate maximum confusion, prevent any coherent interpretation of events, and erode mutual trust among citizens. In essence, it is an internally orchestrated false flag, which Quaglia and Perucchietti read as a half-spoken admission about the nature of certain contemporary political events. This revelation, arguably the beating heart of the film, is nonetheless buried beneath hours of domestic conversations, family quarrels, and meandering, inconsequential digressions. It is as though the most important messages have been deliberately submerged under layers of banality, accessible only to viewers determined enough not to switch off the television before the end. Perucchietti observes that this is precisely the mechanism through which certain kinds of content circulate. They are not shouted, but whispered, embedded within a narrative framework opaque enough to make their identification and decoding difficult for the average viewer. The film also includes a number of lines that Quaglia describes as expressions of a contemporary, fashionably inverted form of racism. In one scene, a black character states outright that white people cannot be trusted. The remark is delivered without any narrative context to justify it, out of sync with the logic of the scene, almost as a kind of signal directed at those who share a particular cultural sensibility. Quaglia places it in the category of identity markers inserted into the text not out of dramatic necessity, but for ideological purposes, reinforcing a certain positioning towards specific social groups by inverting traditional categories of prejudice rather than overcoming them, simply redirecting them instead. Other visual and symbolic elements scattered throughout the film operate in a similar way, as Perucchietti carefully notes. The teenage daughter of the central family wears a NASA t-shirt for much of the film. Recurring shots of satellites appear, along with images of the moon and, particularly striking, a shot of an American flag planted on the lunar surface, which appears on screen without any narrative justification, as if it were meant to communicate something to those able to perceive it. These symbols find no clear meaning within the story itself. They do not serve the plot, develop the characters, or advance the conflict. Perucchietti interprets them as visual messages intended for those capable of reading them, signals operating beneath the threshold of the average viewer's narrative awareness, functioning at a subliminal level of reception. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the discussion concerns the convergence between cinematic fiction and certain real-world events. Quaglia recalls that, just months before the film's release, a crisis simulation had been conducted within circles associated with the World Economic Forum, based on precisely the scenario depicted in the film: a cyber attack that disables internet communications, shuts down mobile networks, and plunges entire nations into chaos. The parallel with the COVID-19 pandemic is immediate, and Quaglia draws it explicitly. In that case, too, only months before the global health crisis unfolded, an exercise, later known as Event 201, had simulated the spread of a pandemic coronavirus with characteristics strikingly similar to those of the virus that would later spread worldwide. According to the two commentators, this coincidence cannot be dismissed as mere chance. If simulations consistently precede real-world events, then the film, produced at a time when the digital blackout scenario had already been rehearsed, takes on a specific function, that of psychologically preparing the public for a scenario that may materialize. This is not necessarily an explicit announcement, but rather a gradual process of normalization. Should such a scenario occur, those who have seen the film would already possess a framework through which to interpret it, facilitating both passive acceptance of events and the official narratives that accompany them. For Quaglia, this is the real reason the film deserves attention despite its artistic shortcomings. The strange resonance between a scenario simulated by global centers of power and one portrayed, however clumsily, in a Netflix production with Obama among its executive producers. Among the film's narrative elements that Quaglia considers relatively successful, at least in intention, if not in execution, is the character of the teenage daughter. In the midst of an end-of-the-world scenario, she shows no interest whatsoever in what is happening around her. Her sole concern is finding out how the TV series Friends ends, to which she is obsessively attached, and which the blackout has suddenly taken away from her. Throughout the film, she desperately searches for a way to reconnect and watch the final episode, indifferent to feuding families, drone-filled skies, and Teslas crashing on the highway. Quaglia sees in this character the only truly successful portrayal in the film, and perhaps the only genuinely credible element in the entire story, that of a generation so detached from reality that it cannot even perceive an apocalyptic scenario as something that directly concerns it. The addiction to television series becomes a metaphor for a deeper disconnection, one between younger generations and the physical, political, and social world they inhabit. In the event of war, the end of the world, or the collapse of civilization, their real problem would be knowing how their favorite show ends. By contrast, the behavior of the other characters strikes Quaglia as implausible and poorly constructed, lacking the credibility that might at least have made the film dramatically effective. Various commentators and reviewers online have, in fact, focused precisely on this aspect. Perucchietti notes that many interpretations center on the girl's fixation with Friends, reading it as a reflection on cinema, television, and serialized storytelling as forces capable of elevating and even saving people. This has sparked a wave of analyses about the redemptive power of storytelling, about narrative as something that can sustain us in times of crisis. All very interesting, Perucchietti observes, except that these readings have completely overshadowed what she sees as the film's real messages, the political and strategic ones, which evidently lie elsewhere. The film also finds an unsettling resonance with certain news stories that emerged around the time of its release. In particular, Perucchietti points to Mark Zuckerberg's massive project on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, a vast underground complex reportedly costing around $270 million, featuring 30 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, a swimming pool, sauna, water cisterns, self-sustaining underground agriculture, and fortified perimeter walls, all monitored by surveillance systems and shrouded in strict secrecy enforced through non-disclosure agreements signed by everyone involved, from construction workers to plumbers, from architects to electricians. Some workers were reportedly dismissed for sharing even minimal details of the project with friends or on social media. This is not an isolated case. Quaglia recalls a well-known 2017 interview in The New Yorker in which Reid Hoffman, co-founder of LinkedIn, revealed not only that he had built his own personal bunker, but that roughly half of his peers in the worlds of big tech and finance had done the same. Obsessed with what they call the event, a possible imminent apocalypse, these billionaires prepare for the end of the world while, paradoxically, often being among the main proponents of the very policies and technologies that could help bring it about. In the film, this scenario is explicitly depicted. Toward the end, the existence of an underground bunker owned by a wealthy individual comes to light, and the protagonists attempt to gain access to it in order to survive. Among the survival supplies shown, Quaglia wryly notes the presence of cans of Spam, the very same items one imagines stocked in the real-life bunkers of Silicon Valley billionaires. Quaglia remarks with a note of bitterness that even the powerful who retreat into such shelters are, in effect, condemning themselves to a kind of voluntary life sentence. If the catastrophe were severe enough, they might never be able to come out again. Far from being an enviable fate, that of the bunker survivor resembles a kind of imprisoned existence, knowing one is confined for life, unable to see sunlight again, waiting for radiation or biological agents to dissipate before returning to the surface. The real question, then, is not how to survive the apocalypse, but how to prevent it. And that is precisely what these billionaires do not seem intent on doing. In this obsession with bunkers, Quaglia identifies a form of madness, the mindset of those who prepare for the worst instead of working to avoid it, trusting in their ability to outlive a disaster they may, in part, be helping to make possible. In the closing part of their discussion, Perucchietti and Quaglia attempt to take stock. The film, Quaglia concedes, is not entirely devoid of interesting ideas. portraying what happens to the global village when the digital connections that hold it together suddenly collapse is, in itself, not a bad premise for a film. But the execution is so mediocre that it squanders any potential. The dialogue is dreadful. Quaglia half-jokes that he hopes it was written by a machine, because if it were the work of a human being, that would be genuinely worrying. The characters' psychologies are poorly constructed and unconvincing, their behavior implausible, and the narrative disperses into countless threads without ever finding a coherent dramatic center. With a cast that includes Julia Roberts, Ethan Hawke, Mahershala Ali, and Kevin Bacon, and with evidently vast production resources, the result is a film that gets lost in domestic squabbles and rambling relationship talk, unable to capitalize on the potential of its own premise. And yet the film exists. It has been watched by millions, sparking debate and commentary. The involvement of the Obamas ensured that many approached it with expectations it failed to meet artistically, but which nevertheless allowed its embedded messages to circulate. Viewers have discussed the crazed deer, the girl obsessed with Friends, the white Teslas, all surface-level readings that leave the deeper layers of the text untouched. The two commentators conclude that this is precisely the point. Propaganda does not need to be good cinema to fulfill its function. In fact, it may work better when concealed within a mediocre entertainment product, because the viewer's critical attention drops, their guard lowers, and the messages pass largely unnoticed. There is, however, one final contradiction in Quaglia's remarks worth highlighting. The same circles that produced this film, and that also embody the push toward ecological transition and electric vehicles, show, in one of the film's most memorable sequences, Teslas crashing en masse. They promote electric mobility and then depict it as something that could kill you. It is cognitive dissonance elevated to a system, the most effective tool for keeping people in a state of permanent confusion and dependence on authorities that appear to be the only ones capable of navigating such contradictions. Perucchietti and Quaglia close by explicitly advising their audience against watching the film. 2 hours of agony that can be spared thanks to their analysis. What ultimately remains from this conversation, beyond the tedium of a failed film, is a genuinely unsettling question. When fiction aligns so closely with simulations conducted by global centers of power, when Silicon Valley billionaires spend hundreds of millions of dollars building bunkers in remote locations, and when a former president of the United States turns to producing apocalyptic thrillers, perhaps it is worth paying attention not to how the film is made, but to what it is trying to say, and to whom, and why. That's all for today. See you in the next episode of Hollywoodism, Movies and Propaganda, here on Compelling Topics.
I went to